Today's discussion is the press and politics, an historical view. The sheer volume of information available today through the media makes the influence of the media in our times beyond dispute. Historically, too, the media have played an essential role in setting the political agenda and shaping public policy. The power of the media was evident even in pre-revolutionary times, when, for example, newspaper owners and readers rallied against the Stamp Act's imposition of taxes on newspapers and other kinds of legal documents. Newspaper publishers, sympathetic to the colonists' cause of ejecting Great Britain from American shores, used their power of the pen to arouse public opinion, and they strongly supported the patriot cause throughout the Revolution. Taking sides in an internal conflict was a new role for the press, one that would sow the seeds of future media influence on the country's domestic and foreign policy. The early history of media development also raised issues that continue to create conflict about the media's role in society. Great leaders learned how intimately their careers were linked to favorable press coverage and influence. From the 1790s to the 1830s, the press served primarily as a vehicle for the leaders of political parties, who expressed their opinions through newspapers known to reflect their particular viewpoints in reporting the news. The circulation of these newspapers was small, but so was their audience. Most people could not read and write and did not vote. By the 1830s, the environment had changed. For openers, the average American was now able to read. New technology made possible the penny press, newspapers that sold for a penny. The field of journalism, the practice of gathering and reporting news, flourished. Circulation increased, and the working class became interested in what the newspaper had to offer. Another reason newspapers reduced their price was the advent of advertising. Newspaper owners figured out if they had sold advertising, they could increase both their profits and their paper circulation. The 1830s was the first time advertising became part and parcel of the newspaper business, and although pressures from advertisers sometimes affected coverage and editorial opinion, few readers noticed that practice, and even fewer challenged it. Over time, the influence of advertising grew exponentially. Although today's major newspapers do not openly change their editorial opinions to please their advertisers, occasionally advertisers flex their muscles, as General Motors did when it withdrew its advertising from the Los Angeles Times after the newspaper recommended the firing of the company's CEO. Throughout the last part of the 19th century, newspapers competed vigorously with one another for ever-grading shares of readership. Publishers found that stories about sex, gore, violence, and government corruption sold papers faster than reports about garbage collection and school budgets. Well-known publishers William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer established their reputations and their fortunes at that time. Hearst with the New York Journal-American and Pulitzer with the New York World. Along with Hearst and Pulitzer, at the beginning of the 20th century came the practice of yellow journalism, so named after the yellow ink used in the Yellow Kid cartoons in the New York World. The term yellow journalism has come to signify an irresponsible, sensationalist approach to news reporting and is used to this day to criticize certain elements of the press. The most famous example of the impact of yellow journalism came with both Hearst and Pulitzer's support of the United States entry into the Spanish-American War in 1898. This conflict is sometimes referred to as the Newspaper War, because of the major role of the press in President William McKinley's decision to invade Cuba and later the Philippines. Public sentiment in the United States, influenced by reports of Spanish cruelty towards the Cubans during and after the Cuban independence movement, strongly favored Cuba. Hearst and Pulitzer, followed by other newspapers across the country, fanned the flames of war with sensational and lurid anti-Spanish stories, dwelling on the brutality of the Spanish towards Cuban rebels. The precipitating event, the explosion of the USS Battleship Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898, may or may not have been due to a Spanish torpedo, according to recent evidence. But press reports, accompanied by the cry, "Remember the Maine," galvanized the public in Congress. The President responded to the intensifying pressures, and Congress declared war on Spain in April. The press and public had guided public policy. Hard on the heels of the Spanish-American newspaper war came the era of muckraking, an about-face that placed journalists in the heroic role of exposing the dark underbelly of government and industry. The most famous of the muckrakers included Ida Tarbell, who exposed the oil industry in a series of articles running from 1902 to 1904 in McClure's magazine. Lincoln Steffens, who published The Shame of the Cities in 1904, and Upton Sinclair, whose novel The Jungle in 1906 revealed the horrors of the meatpacking industry, leading to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and later to the establishment of the Food and Drug Administration. Yellow journalism died down after World War I, and newspapers entered a period that, at least on the surface, valued objectivity. Newspapers increasingly found themselves competing with the new media that were just coming into being. Radio stations from 1920 to 1950, television from the 1940s to 1980s, and from then on, the explosion of the new media, cable television, the internet blogs, and satellite technology. This increased competition has had several impacts on the newspaper industry. First, newspaper readership has steadily declined, particularly the audience for local newspapers. For example, this table shows that between 1998 and 2008, the proportion of people who read a local newspaper every day, or several times a week, decreased from 68% to 53%. This figure also illustrates that although readership of national newspapers increased slightly after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, since that time, readership has ebbed to the same level as before the attacks. Partly as a result of the long-term decline in local newspaper readership, the number of daily newspapers has decreased dramatically, with many cities that used to support 3 or 4 dailies now typically having one newspaper. Second, competition has resulted in consolidation of the newspaper industry, so that today a single large parent company typically owns many local newspapers. For example, the Gannett Corporation, which publishes USA Today, also publishes numerous daily and weekly newspapers in towns throughout our country, including Binghamton. Third, competition has forced nearly every newspaper to offer free online editions. Thus, you can receive nearly any newspaper at no cost in your email inbox each morning. Beyond falling readership, the newspaper industry has changed as society has changed. Large cities are now likely to have smaller weekly publications targeted to specific demographic audiences, gays, women, African Americans, for example, and to publish foreign language newspapers appealing to such diverse newcomers to the United States as Mexican, Brazilian, Vietnamese, Iranian, Nigerian, and Russian immigrants. As the industry has changed, so too has the human face of the newsrooms. This figure shows that in 2009, more than 1/3 of all newspaper supervisors were women, as were more than 40% of all layout and copy editors and reporters. Those figures reflect the societal changes from the times when newsmen were in fact newsmen. Among all positions measured in the annual newsroom census, women were least likely to hold jobs in the visual arts such as photographer and artist. This table shows another measure of how modern newspapers have changed along with American society. The table illustrates the proportion of minority journalists working at newspapers in 8 circulation categories. From this table, we can see that minority journalists are much more likely to be employed at larger circulation newspapers, with minorities constituting 1/5 of the journalists at papers having a circulation of 250 to 500,000. That proportion is nearly identical at the largest circulation newspapers and steadily tapers off among newspapers with circulation of less than 250,000.